This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. My guest on podcast episode 199 is Alex Flores, head brewer for Urban South Brewery in New Orleans, Louisiana. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
Thanks for having me. Definitely an honor.
We're doing this one remotely out of the brand new podcast studio here at our Craft Beer and Brewing new headquarters on 1300 Riverside Avenue in Fort Collins. If you are a brewer out there that sends us beer for review, please do not send to our old address as of now. Check that email that I sent out to everyone. And if you're a brewer out there that would like to submit beer for review, I guess I should mention this too. You can just pop onto the Help Center of beerandbrewing.com. We have a whole Help Center article about how to get your beer reviewed in Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. We do not gatekeep it. Everyone is welcome to submit beers. There's no cost to do so. You just ship it to us. We don't guarantee that we'll review any of it. We taste through it. We try to review the best and publish those top reviews in the magazine, and that's how that goes. Anyway, I digress. Let's get back to talking about brewing. Urban South brews everything from lagers to hazy and West Coast IPAs to hard seltzers and a whole lot more. Today, we're going to talk about quick sour beers. They're lime cucumber gose, tangerine, pop tangerine sour, rocket pop gose, the spilled line of heavily fruited sour beers. This lime cucumber gose just last year at GABF won a gold medal in the field beer category. It seems like a great opportunity to dig in and talk about how you all make compelling, heavily fruited, sometimes not as heavily fruited, different kinds of quick sour beers that have different flavor goals and construct interesting beers that are compelling to consumers and also do that across a range of different kinds of flavors and iterations from clean and crisp to really over the top and fruity. And so we're going to talk about, all of those kinds of brewing concerns. Before we do that, G&D Chillers, born in the Pacific Northwest from a lot of hard work and a singular goal, they've become the best damn chiller company in the world. Like you, G&D never settles. They're relentless and strive to be better every single day because they take pride in the work they do. They're craftsmen who know that good enough just won't cut it. Visit G&D Chillers at the Craft Brewers Conference booth 3011 or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, even the best yeast deserves a helping hand with seltzer fermentation, which is why Pathfinder N-Pure Seltzer Nutrient ensures reliable and complete fermentation of a seltzer base while providing a clean, neutral fermentation profile. Not to mention, it provides all the essential nutrients required by yeast for production of hard seltzer bases fermented from those sweet, refined sugars. Give your seltzer yeast a boost by visiting bsgcraftbrewing.com and searching for Pathfinder N-Pure Seltzer Nutrient or call BSG at 1-800-374-2739. So, Alex, talk to me about your history in beer. How you got where you are now as head brewer of Urban South, and what that kind of arc of career you followed to get there.
Yeah, so I've been brewing for going on 12 years now. I went to Louisiana State University here in Louisiana. I was sitting in a psychology class with my best friend James, and we're kind of talking in between the lecture and talking about home brewing. We'd always loved digging into beers, obviously like Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. This is back in 2008. Went home, found a homebrew store about 50 miles away, bought a kit, started brewing. I started driving. I'm from New Orleans originally, started driving back down and volunteering when NOLA Brewing had first started, just cleaning kegs, scrubbing tanks, like whatever they needed at that point. I think there were a few months at that point. I moved out to San Diego right after LSU and started working out there. I started, before I even got out there, I called a ton of breweries, sent some emails, got a few calls back telling me you have no experience, get some experience and send a resume in. Fortunately, Pat McElhenney from Alpine, he actually reached out and he's like, look, man, I love your your fact you don't even live here yet. You're already hitting people up to work in this industry, but you do need some volunteer work, and that's I started putting in time. And I happened to find a brewery that was just opening the month I moved there to San Diego in August, called Manzanita, which is no longer around, but it was a small 3-barrel brewery. These two engineers that were homebrew friends, and started this little brewery out in East County, San Diego. Got some time in there for free. I was driving there every day and working 12-hour days, whatever they needed me to do. Oh, it was brutal. It was hot. East County is basically the desert of California, of San Diego,
Sure.
so it's super hot. So we're out there brewing, doing 12-hour days brewing. Basically, there's no rakes, no nothing, just all manual paddling. A gravity-fed kettle. Knockouts took 2 hours to knock out 3 barrels of beer. It's brutal, but it was fun. Got to put that on my resume. I went over to Mission Brewery about 6 months later. And the guy, John Egan, who is the former head brewer for Mission, he looked me dead in the eyes. He's like, I know you've been brewing. I know you've been, I've been helping with recipe design at Manzanita. He's like, you're going to label bottles and clean kegs, and that's where you're going to start. I was like, let's go. So, so I went back all the way back down to the scrub work, and which kind of still do nowadays anyway. But and then I moved back home to New Orleans. I ran the sour beer and barrel program at NOLA Brewing for about a year and a half. And then Jacob, the owner of Urban South, reached out to see if I wanted to come help develop some new products for them at Urban South. And, 5 years later, I'm now the head brewer. So I came in as an R&D brewer to Urban South. And after our previous head brewer started his own place in Memphis, Wes Osier, started a brewery called Hampline up there. He moved back home. I stepped into his shoes, and here we go. So it's been a fun path, and met a lot of great people through the years. Got to live in San Diego, so I really can't complain.
Sure. There's a few good breweries out in San
A little
Diego.
bit.
Urban South has been on a pretty extreme trajectory over the last few years, and building a great name for themselves, making fantastic beer, and growing very, very, very quickly. You all have opened up a Houston location in addition to the New Orleans original brewery. Distribution is expanding through the South. Obviously, we wrote about Urban South as a case study in our latest brewing industry guide. There's a lot going on right there, and the story of Urban South is one of rapid growth right now.
It really is. When I first came to Urban South, when I first really met Jacob and Kyle, our other founder, they're very calculated. Jacob's definitely a dreamer. Kyle's more the roots, the realistic, numbers driven. So they both kind of balance each other out. Jacob's always shooting for the moon, and it's helped us to be really calculated in our development and our growth. We never seem to be over our skis, and everything has a purpose and a reason. It's this premeditated attack. It's never just flying by the seat of our pants, and it's been really fun to see that growth. It's helped me develop professionally in a sense that it helps me to stay calm. There's always a plan in place and the right resources behind. Opening in Houston, we looked at a couple different options. We were going to distribute in Houston. The way the South works is you're very hometown focused. Houston is very Houston proud. New Orleans is very New Orleans proud. And Alabama and Florida. And as is most cities in the country. The premise was to brew beer in New Orleans, distribute it to Texas. What was a better idea was to actually hire a brewer from Texas, open up a brew pub, have roots on the ground there,
Right.
Create jobs, create a brewery there, let them do their own thing, which obviously they focus on a lot of like hazy and fruited sours. It's where the Spilled series was born from our head brewer Dave Omer there. But yeah, it was just a great opportunity to like get into the community, build jobs there, have a local brewer that already had a following, really get to, cut his teeth in a whole new industry in our, Urban South tap room there. So it was more of a better opportunity for us to make more of an impact on the community there than to just distribute beer and not really have any skin in the game. And I think it's really worked out. They get a lot of love and beautiful tap room if you ever had a chance to visit it. But
Yeah, Houston is one of those underrated beer towns where, or I should say, there's a large audience, and there
yeah,
are a growing number of craft breweries serving that audience. and even the existing number of breweries is not
Right.
nearly enough to potentially serve the size of that market.
It's
No, I hear
amazing.
you. Yeah, I hear you on the south. I grew up in Orlando, Florida, and went to
Okay.
college in Memphis at Rhodes College in Memphis, and have spent a lot of time. My family's originally, my mom and grandparents are from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and so
Okay.
we have a lot of southern roots,
Hmm.
and spent a lot of time in the South. And it's, yeah, I know what you're
Yeah.
saying. It's even cities as close as Houston and New Orleans have a pretty tight rivalry, and I'm not going to mention your LSU background because we're Florida Gators in my household,
Yeah.
and that's a
Yeah.
pretty heavy rivalry right there.
Yeah, we could talk
Um,
about Tim Tebow another time. Those are
oh
brutal
my
games in
goodness.
Tiger Stadium.
Oh yeah, yeah. Nonetheless, so what is the production of Urban South up to these days, or
Yeah,
thereabouts,
so
roughly?
we are on pace currently, if COVID can stay away for this year, to do about 25,000 barrels. When I first got to Urban South, we had eclipsed 2,500. So it's been quite the growth. I think
Yeah,
yeah, we hit 18,000 in 2019. Going into Mardi Gras, which Mardi Gras is always our big spike, obviously.
sure.
And apropos, it was also the COVID spike. So it was we're on pace to do about 28,000 in 2020. We finished just above 18,500. And then this year we're probably fall at, I think realistically maybe around 22 or 23, but we're on brewing on a pace of 25 right now, which is great. I mean, it's incredible. So
That is absolutely the fast growth story, and it's interesting to me that it's built on a whole bunch of different strategies. It's not just making hyped beer; it is making lagers because you live in an area that's warm, and of course Texas loves their lagers also.
right.
Yeah, you're making everything from lagers to IPAs, and then of course a lot of fruited, quick sour beers that certainly have helped bring new audiences into the world of craft beer and make craft beer relevant for those audiences, which I think is an important thing. And even that kind of lager lover in me will never write off the idea that craft brewers have found styles of beer to make craft beer exciting to people that otherwise might not drink craft beer. That's a cool thing. Let's talk a little bit more about how you make some of those beers. But first, the most common complaint about hard seltzers, they need more flavor. Extract alone is a weak flavoring agent that can leave a chemical aftertaste, but there's a better way. The craft concentrate blends from Old Orchard are packed with real fruit first, no added sugars, and just enough natural flavor. Breweries are turning to Old Orchard concentrates for seltzer with more body, color, and aroma. Turn seltzer skeptics into supporters with seltzer that drinks like a beer. Get started at www.oldorchard.com/brewer. Also, with nearly 20 years of innovation and experience, Brewmation specializes in electric, steam, and direct fire brew houses, complete cellar solutions, and automated controls for the craft brewing industry. From the half barrel to 30 barrel systems, Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs and brewing style. Whether you're starting a new brewery, upgrading your cellar, or just need some parts to keep you up and running, Brewmation has you covered. Visit them at brewmation.com to get started. Yeah, interesting about that whole hard seltzer thing. One of the things I love about the way that you all brew is it tends to be, especially on this kind of seltzer hard or quick sour, and I'll just call them quick sours rather than Kettle-Sours
Yeah.
because the processes for quick souring aren't all kettle driven these days,
Right.
and that may be different. But I love that you all approach it flavor first. That you've built these almost like verticals of brands like Rocket Pop that span hard seltzer and your quick sour beers, and it's a flavor profile attached to the brand rather than a beer style attached to the brand. It's kind of a conceptually cool way to approach this, so that if people like a certain flavor expression and they want, say, something with more acidity that drinks more like a beer, or they want the lighter hard seltzer version of that, they can flip back and forth.
Yeah. So, and kind of going back to our calculated, path into a lot of these products, and obviously Lime Cucumber Gose, when we first released that beer, was a major hit. Especially being, it's hot in the south. Like right now, it's 110 outside,
Oof.
and 90% humidity to add on top of that. But something like a easy drinking 4.5% Gose, lime and cucumber, super refreshing. Something like that just hits down here. When you translate that to a seltzer, hits even more. I mean, you have that bubbly, nice and clean
Right.
seltzer, fresh pressed cucumber juice. It just works, and it's a good way because that brand already has so much love. So it's easy for people to see that in the store and they're like, oh, I like the Gose, try the seltzer. And same thing with the Rocket Pop and Raspberry Limeade is the other one in that variety pack. But I think it helps people keep that brand recognition, keep brand loyalty, which I think is really tough these days. So anything you can do to kind of keep everything in your house, definitely helps.
I find that fascinating that you have a beer, a medal winning beer like Lime Cucumber Gose, and you're like, well, our approach to flavoring this in the Gose works well. Let's apply that same process of flavor and profile to a hard seltzer. And can we make it, express in a similar kind of way? And,
Right.
And sometimes that's the same consumer and sometimes it's a different consumer,
Right.
but, who just wants a hard seltzer with the different caloric and kind of,
Right.
expression of that. But what a fun and interesting way to kind of, approach that. Let's talk about how, in this kind of quick sour approach, some of the kind of fundamentals, how you approach, say, building a base beer, and then how you approach at a pretty significant scale, acidifying these small beers.
Yeah. So with with the Gose, it's really simple. I mean, we use a pale ale base malt, and then just wheat malt. We use some flaked wheat as well. I mean, it's super simple. I doubt that many Goses really deviate from that kind of 50-50 or whether it's flaked wheat. I just like the component of the flaked wheat. We used to brew it with just white wheat. I think adding 10% flaked wheat is just giving us a little more depth in that beer. I think it helps give a little more meat. It doesn't get tore up as much in the kettle during the sour. And then we use Omega's souring blend. We've kept it alive for going on 3+ years now. So we just kind of do the Solera method. Bring it down to 100 degrees, add 2 brinks. We just do 30 gallons per 40 barrels of wort in the kettle. Generally, we can see acidification in under 8 hours. So we'll knock it out at the end of the night, come in the next morning, and start our boil from there, harvest our
So that process
Solera.
is happening then in the kettle itself.
It is.
And you're like an overnight sit for
exactly
8-ish hours in order to.
Yeah, we generally see between 8
What
and
size?
12.
Sorry, what size is your kettle, and then how much is your pitch?
So we have a 30-barrel brew house. Our pitch is 30 gallons, but we generally draw off about 40 barrels of wort for the Gose into our kettle. We can get about 50 barrels in our kettle. It's kind of an oversized kettle, and then so we do 30 gallons of culture. And it works like a charm. Just let it do its thing. And
yeah, do you how do you check viability on this kind of ongoing lactoculture?
We'll plate it. It tends to grow pretty quick. We have we're getting a much better sensory and lab program in the past really 6 to 8 months. We got a guy, Colin from Modern Times, that came in, and he's really brought us to another level. But generally it's we'll do some lab samples, and as long as it's acidifying and under his testing, then we're good to go. But really haven't had any issues. I mean, it's been 3+ years now, and it's still rock and roll. So
it just rips in a similar kind of time every single time.
I think it's one of those things you try not to question it. You just let it do its thing. Tastes great. And,
of course, the more we observe and ask questions about it, the more something is eventually going to happen to it.
I know. The worst thing that could happen is someone boils it. But we generally we'll harvest 3 kegs of it and then pitch 2 and always have 1 just in case. But so
you're drawing off a little bit before you start the boil from the kettle in order to kind of keep
so
that.
We'll dump a lot of the true. I mean, you'll see a lot of protein drop and whatever else got drew over from the lauter tun. So we'll dump a good bit, pull what we like, we'll test it, and then harvest the rest, and just boil on.
That's interesting. So I hadn't thought about how that process of souring in a kettle creates all of those additional fun pieces of having to clean that up before you start boiling it, so you're not boiling a whole mess of garbage,
Right.
through that. Well, yeah, how do you evaluate that and kind of make a call as to when it's clean and clear and ready to go?
It's tough in a kettle.
You don't really have a conical bottom there to draw off.
Exactly, the slope is so minimal, and lacto doesn't. I mean, it will a little bit, but it doesn't really give you that slurry paste like a yeast, like a normal brewer's yeast would. You'll get, and what you're really seeing is more of what draw from the lauter tun, and not necessarily because
Sure.
that lacto. I mean, we've seen it get to 2.5. Generally, we will pull it at 3.4 is where we like to stop at, and we know between like 8 and 10 hours will fall in that range. But we kind of draw off, look at it.
If things get crazy, you can always blend between a couple of these. One is in the tank.
Exactly. We always have other beers on tap, or
Yeah.
so it does have to have that volume because we can blend out
Right.
if really need be, but try to shoot for the numbers.
Sure. But right, you're brewing this with all of that wheat in it, and of course that's a whole bunch of protein, and that's all
Mhm.
stuff that potentially settles out as it sits like that in your kettle.
Yeah, you get a lot of coagulation on the top. Obviously, there's a pretty interesting like lactic krausen on top. So a lot of those solids like to fall out, but it's part of the kettle souring process. There's going to be a lot of junk in there. We try to run a caustic clean before we do a kettle sour, so there's no hop alphas that are going to tear down the lacto. I mean that's always another problem. We've seen that before where we had run IPA all week and then we did a sour and it just really wasn't going. And then it kind of hits you. Oh yeah, that would have been smart to scrub those walls down. So kind of live and you learn. But
No, that's kind of fascinating that even after a simple kind of cleaning process or rinsing process, there still might be
still something in there.
still enough alpha acids left over
Right.
from a hoppy beer.
Yeah, and that was all week of brewing IPA. I mean, those walls get so nasty. If you've ever looked inside of a end of the week brewing kettle, they can get pretty gnarly. And we try to do caustics every night now and run acids
Yeah.
once a week so we can keep our brew house pretty clean. But especially we run so many different styles of beers. The lager, obviously, you don't want
Sure.
any cross contamination on that side either. So
Yeah. In terms of oxygen, obviously, while you're kettle souring, conventional logic has it that you want to minimize oxygen uptake because it tends to produce some off flavors with lactobacillus. How do you in this larger brew system, manage for that kind of lower oxygen environment, or is that even a concern for you all?
I mean, it's a concern, and I think for us, our production schedule is so tight, and we're fighting for every barrel we can get out of the brewery right now. So we do everything, to prohibit any sort of oxygen intake. But we have an open stack to the atmosphere, so that can pose a little bit of a difficulty. We generally just hook up CO2 to our spray ball and let that kind of go in at a very low rate. Generally, our lacto takes off pretty quick. We'll start to see a little like prickling right off the top of the wort after about an hour. So we'll see that. So we know after like a few hours we'll have some pretty good action. So I'm not super concerned with it, but having that blanket on top definitely helps. We probably should install some sort of door that goes through the kettle stack, but we haven't had any issues, and we have an Anton Par C box that we can run and check, and generally we come out of the kettle pretty low, and it's not anything to be worried about. But and then
Yeah.
vigorous boil, we still have to boil, so there is something with that. But yeah, I mean, knock on wood, we haven't. Now my kettle sour is going to die, and I'm going to get oxygen on the next batch. But
Have you all ever, in brewing these beers, had that experience where oxygen produced a little funkier flavor than you were expecting?
one thing we have noticed is with if we don't quite get a very vigorous, like some mornings we'll come in and there'll be big old krausen head off the top of the kettle where it comes up several feet. It's almost coming out of the door. Those tend to be a lot more there's a big argument. There's not a lot of depth in kettle souring, and I'd agree. If you have a barrel aged sour with a mixed culture, of course, that's going to have plenty more depth than a stainless steel kettle soured, lactic, base. However, I think when we get these really vigorous boils, we're getting a lot more fruit. We're getting these big, like punchy citrus notes that are really cool. If you come in the morning and there's not that big krausen head, it tends to be this more dull, almost a little more that THP character that you can kind of find in these sours. A little more like cereal grain, like a unfermented wort flavor with the acidity, but it's just not as pungent, not as much depth. So that was one thing we noticed, and that's kind of where we've been over pitching. Our lacto. I think it's instead of one brink, we've been doing two just to make sure. But I think that's really helped get that vigorous krausen that tends to produce a little bit more of that depth of flavor than something a little more basic.
Sure. No, so it's interesting that you are counting on some actual flavor component addition from the lacto and not just acidity, that you can sense a difference in the quality of that lactic fermentation in the kettle,
Right.
in the end product, even after you're adding fruit and everything else into it, that, that certain, you're saying heavier pitches give
Right.
you a better quality, of acidic fermentation there.
Yeah, and I think in the Gose base, obviously we're doing cucumber and lime. There's not a lot of cucumber.
Right.
It's not a heavy flavor, so you're going to taste. It would taste as if we just hit it with lactic acid in the fermenter and maybe not necessarily kettle soured it. I've had a lactic acid sour, and you can tell when you have a lactic acid sour versus a kettle sour versus a mixed ferm sour. But yeah, I do believe with these vigorous fermentations, we're getting a lot more flavor. It showed up in some of our sensory panels. I think there's some more depth to it, and I think it's a little more nuanced than just your typical kettle sour. Even though we are going to douse it with fruit at some point for some of the base.
Sure. Now that's an interesting one that I would love to unpack a little bit, because, certainly for a commercial brewery, there is, if you're making a beer where you're putting a ton of fruit into the finished product, there is a argument to be made for simply using lactic acid, food grade lactic acid in a fermenter rather than going through a lactic fermentation in a kettle, tying that up, going through even that process. And so,
Right.
You've got the old school long term, 2 year in wood mixed fermentation, kind of proponents claiming that kettle sours are too simplistic, and now we've got the kettle sour argument that the next step of easier of just adding lactic to it, produces an even less complex beer. But I'm curious about that, and it sounds like you may have done some just bench testing and to try to taste through and sample what these differences might be like. How would you describe that difference in a kind of base beer with this lactic fermentation? And you called it mixed fermentation. I assume this culture that you're using from Omega of lactobacillus has more than one lactobacillus strain, or simply that lactobacillus is producing more than just other components, not just lactic acid. How would you describe that comparison to, say, food grade lactic acid?
Right. And what I meant by mixed firm, I was saying compared to a true mixed firm,
Sure.
with Brett and PDO and lacto.
Right. We have this whole scale of complexity
Right.
that starts up there with these long-term, 4-month to multiple year, mixed fermentation, traditional wood aged
Right.
sour beers. And then, right. And here you've got this kettle sour process that is still using lactobacillus in order to produce this acidity, but it has the potential to create other compounds in addition to just lactic acid,
Right.
that can also impact everything from mouthfeel to flavor. And then you've got buying an industrial drum
Of lactic acid.
food grade
Right.
lactic acid and adding
Right.
that to a beer to create acidity, but that is just going to be lactic acid and nothing else.
Right.
Talk to me a little bit about that. I'm curious about that impact of the quality of that you all have sought out in this lactic culture that you're using for this quick fermentation.
It's funny to talk when you talk to people that are doing mixed culture barrel, 2 year, like we're talking about, bottled beer. Like my brain straight, goes to Vinny out in the West Coast and Lost Abbey, Tommy down in San Diego. These beers are phenomenal. There's not many beers, that you can't replace that flavor. You can't replace that effort and the time that goes into those. Like, there's just nothing. You can't kettle sour your way into a Cuvée Tame. I mean, you just can't. But no one's arguing that you can. I think what we've seen in the past couple of years in the beer industry is that people are trying to get beer from A to B as quickly as possible, and kettle souring is the method to do that. Now we've seen these heavily fruited sours, which it throws the beer world into a tizzy because it's the haters and the lovers, and people are having fun with them. And you're not necessarily going to do a mixed firm, add 800 pounds of fruit per barrel, and because then what's the point of doing all the 2 years of aging of your beer? But yeah, with lactic acid, I mean, if you've ever had,
I love all these things and don't find them all mutually exclusive. And I think there's a consumption mode where, like, if I was going to drink a fruity cocktail, I can drink a heavily fruited quick sour beer and enjoy it and have it light and bright, or even the hard seltzer. Don't don't take away my beer card for that.
Right.
But at the same time, if I'm in a pensive mood and want to enjoy a beautiful bottle of beer, then sure, right, I'll go grab a lambic or
exactly
an American wild ale that's crafted in this kind of thoughtful, contemporary, beautiful or traditional beautiful way.
With the lactic acid, if you've ever had a lactic acid sour, it has this tanginess to it. I mean, you can tell right away that it was a lactic acid sour. There's a tanginess to it. There's not a lot of depth of flavor. You have the acidity, but it's not necessarily a rounded acidity. It's very disjointed, sharp acidity, and then the other flavors that, if it's let's say a mango lactic sour, it's lactic tang, mango fruit, and they're on opposite sides of the table. They're not necessarily together. And I find with a kettle sour, you're at least having a base that is sour together, that is harmonious in its flavors, fermented with whatever strain you want to use, and then you're putting it on whatever your secondary flavors are. And I think that's a way to marry everything together rather than just adding lactic acid after the fact. The whole process is done. That during the boil, you're homogenizing all your flavors. During the fermentation, you're homogenizing even further. And then if for us, we use a recirculation pump. So we're adding fruit, we're recirculating it, and then, we're packaging it, carbonating it together. So everything is done together versus let's get this beer to the bright tank, let's pump in 2 liters of lactic acid and carbonate it. It's such a separate after the fact. And I think it's the same way you taste, you can taste an extract flavoring versus real fruit, like a coconut versus real coconut. There's a big, there's a disjointed flavor. And I think that's what you get when you take that, obviously kettle souring is a shortcut, but lactic acid is definitely the,
it's even
shorter shortcut.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'll dive into a few more complexities on this, but first, your beer deserves all your attention. Clarion makes that a little easier. Their food grade lubricants will help keep your system running smooth while also safeguarding your product from costly contamination and recall, because then you'll be in full compliance with food safety standards, and it's all thanks to a simple switch to Clarion. A food safe system lets you focus on your craft. We'll drink to that. Go to clarionlubricants.com to learn more. No matter what beverage kind of sector you're in, whether if you're in winemaking, winemakers have acid blends to tweak and adjust the way that their fermentation expressions, come out, but they don't just use those commercial acid blends without the kind of natural base. I mean, we find the same thing in kind of adjunct flavoring that, oftentimes more brewers than will admit to it are using some sort of extract because extract tends to express really well in aromas. But if you just use that extract and you're not using some of that real ingredient, the flavor is not going to be as compelling. And so a lot of times these things are used, can be used in concert with each other rather, but if it's simply a lactic acid without that, food grade lactic acid without some of that natural component, I wouldn't be surprised if, you're also, because again, these lactic acid bacteria produce other compounds in addition to just lactic acid. And some of those things do kind of create everything from, the mouthfeel and sensation. Obviously wheat's doing a big part of that too,
Right.
with this kind of Gose. But all of those things working together are what kind of even make them compelling as what they are. But it's an interesting way to think about that. I mean, yeah, you could, if you didn't quite hit your acidity goals, you certainly could
Yeah.
add a little bit of food grade lactic acid to it. But if it was just, if that was all it was, then it
Right.
wouldn't quite be the same.
And kind of what we talked about earlier, we were joking, but you still have an opportunity to make your beer right before it hits consumer. And if
Sure.
that's adjusting with lactic acid or citric acid or, adding more fruit or, blending out to mute some flavors. I mean, I think all those things are acceptable. People, there's both camps. You put in the effort to do the mixed firm barrel beers, and they're wonderful. And then people also, you do your best effort to make a clean kettle sour. And I think there can play both. I remember when craft beer, everyone was like, we can do so much. We're better than the big guys. And then now everyone tries to, stifle other people, and they talk trash about certain styles. But that's what craft beer is. I mean, people are experimenting. People are having fun. I mean, that's the whole point of it. And I think if you actually put effort and quality behind whatever method you're doing, at least that's at the end of the day, that's a great thing, I think, for consumers and for our industry and as a whole.
I think that last point that you make is exactly right. That if you approach a spirit of experimentation and trying new things and creating new flavors, that is a beautiful and fantastic thing. Do it with integrity and do it with authenticity. And if you find yourself taking, corporate production shortcuts in order to speed up production and drive more profit, or, at the expense of quality, then maybe that's not the craft approach,
Right.
But that you can certainly take even making these styles of beer that are more acid and fruit forward and not as built around funk and complexity, Britannomyces and whatnot,
Yeah.
Britannomyces, then, these can be interesting expressions,
Right.
and they can make compelling beers. Just make them with, that kind of
Yeah.
craft
And I've
mentality.
been in, I think it was, CBC. It was 2 years ago in Denver. And the last one. I got into a spirited debate with someone from Chicago, and basically, saying that fruited sours are garbage and there's no complexity and there's no funky, and I'm sitting here thinking, I'm like, well, it's not a funky beer. I mean, it's a kettle sour with fruit. We're not trying to make a lambic. We're not. So you're mad about it, but you're also not describing the right product at the end of the day. I mean, the cantaloupe mango fruited sour we just made is not supposed to be this bread heavy, because there is no bread. There is no mixed culture. It's supposed to be about the fruit, about the cantaloupe and mango. Being a fun concoction into a can. And but it was just funny. It's putting that effort behind it and making a fun product, I think, is at the end of the day the right move.
No, and I think I think that's also an important distinction, that
Very.
all of these are different products and they can coexist, and that one is not trying to be another.
Right.
One is not I know that there are traditional sour beer makers who are frustrated that the market for traditional sour beer has changed or fallen off or hasn't, continued to grow in the way that they expected it to. I don't think that it is quick sour beers that have caused that necessarily. I think that, that was always a limited market for the kind of person that wants to enjoy a very complex, funky, Britannomyces forward, kind of sour beer. I love them. I drink a lot of those. And yet I can also, that market is not a big and broad one, in the same way that there are specialty spirits and wines and everything else that not everybody is going to drink because they're challenging, and that is okay. But these are, as you said, these are kinds of different approaches. We've veered off into this kind of philosophical realm there, and I want to kind of get back and talk a little bit about brewing. Talk to me about water and salinity. especially in Gose, that, is there any special approach to water? Obviously, being in the South, I mean, that water is not as pristine, and it doesn't come out of the pipe for you in the same way that it might for some of us who have beautiful mountain water running off of surface reservoirs. Talk to me a little bit about how you make sure that the water that you brew with helps express these beers in the best way possible, and then talk to me about how you dial in salinity for something like a Gose.
Yeah, so we are fed directly river water, which we get all the trash from all the way from up north.
Sure.
So
sure.
our water, by the time it gets down here, is we have the name the Muddy Mississippi for a reason. So we use RO and strip our water down. We get it tested pretty regularly, and there's pretty much all zeros across the board, which is great. It also creates a little bit of difficulty, especially you start to get in like New England IPAs and things like that require a lot more carbonate levels and obviously chloride and sulfate ratios and things like that. But with a Gose, it's actually really nice. We can start really simple. We try to hit. I like a more chloride forward, almost a little bit heavier than 1-to-1. Maybe like 1.25 to 1 sulfate. Just to have a little bit more fullness. I try to think on the back end, you're going to have that lactic, a little bit or a sharp mouthfeel. We generally carbonate to a pretty high volume, so there's a bit of a bite on that end as well. So I think a more full, soft water profile kind of helps balance that product out a little bit, and that's kind of where we've headed. And I'm not. I through the podcast, I hear a lot of brewers, they always talk about tweaking and these calculated, and we are as well. We do a lot of sensory, if we start picking up on something we don't like, or if we have another product that we're like, oh, we kind of like that, we'll dig into it a little bit and develop our water profile. But that's where we're at now, is a little more calcium chloride heavy as opposed to sulfate. We used to be more sulfate heavy. And then for salt, we're doing about 0.1 pounds per barrel of salt. So we will add it depending on what our end volume is going to be. So we try to be as calculated with that as possible. So we're adding the same amount every time. But yeah, it's a nice soft salinity. The base Gose is really nice. We do coriander as well. So you get that nice coriander and salt component. But yeah, our Gose doesn't tend to be too heavy in the salt. I know there are a few other on the Gulf Coast that are pretty salty, almost drink like a margarita with the amount of salt that's in it. And for our flavor profile and we tend to we don't really want as much salt as some of those more heavily salted Goses, but kind of distracts a little bit for my taste anyway. So.
Yeah, a little bit of salt is a nice way to kind of put a finer point on the other fruit flavors in there, and too much, then it just becomes about the salt.
Yeah, it's a little salty, and it gets a little briny. And I think with the, we already get it when we just did finally a beer festival in Nashville about a month ago, and you get 20 people that come up and they love the lime cucumber Gose, and then you get that one person every 20 people that's like, this tastes like a pickle. And I think when that salt tends to be higher, the pickles comments seem to be higher. I think you get more of that brininess. So I think you gotta be really careful with how much salt you're throwing at, if you're going with cucumber anyway. But also the salt kind of gives me a burning sensation in my mouth when it's too heavy. And that's kind of what we picked up in sensory panels. That it kind of leaves a little bit of that astringency on your tongue. So it's something we've kind of laid back from.
I always tend to get more watermelon than cucumber out of cucumber beers.
Interesting.
They're so similar,
Mm-hmm.
But I find that, generally speaking, especially if there's a little bit of residual sweetness to it. In terms of that, what's a finishing gravity for something like Cucumber Lime Gose?
Yeah, our Gose generally finishes between 1.5 Plato and 1.8. So we'll see pretty high, actually. It's a little bit of sweetness, which it works really well for that beer. I think when I was at NOLA, a lot of our sours finished at negative, and they would be very, very, very harsh. They require a pretty good amount of blending to really get that mouthfeel to be acceptable, as I would call it. It would rip your tongue apart. But I think with a little bit of higher, and that's not very high by any means, but it definitely helps to promote a little bit more of that mouthfeel, a little bit more sweetness. And I think that with, something like cucumber that doesn't have a lot of sweetness, if you have a little bit of the base sweetness in your finished product, it kind of helps promote that fruit a little bit more, give it a little more life. Oftentimes I feel like a lot of people experience, like watermelon's a great one where I'd say, half the time, if not more, when someone's having a watermelon product, it's probably fake watermelon. So the idea they have of watermelon in their head is a sweeter, more candy-like product. And I think when you have a sweeter base, it kind of promotes some of that natural fruit flavor. I think it definitely helps promote some more flavor in our Gose.
Yeah, let's talk about fruit because certainly that's a big part of this. And so in terms of process, you knock out of this kettle. What do you ferment with to ferment the beer itself?
Yeah, so for our Gose, we just use USO5. It's just kind of our house easy brick to throw
just
in.
Clean and neutral,
And loves the acidity. Cranks right off. We knock out at 64 degrees and we set at 66, so we let it rise up to 66. We're generally seeing 4 to 5 day ferments. We'll go through some diacetyl tests and then we'll crash. Centrifuge and move on to fruiting back to the bright tank. So we add all of our cucumber juice and lime juice into the bright tank for carbonation.
And you do it with juice then in a liquid form rather than a puree or whole fruit or anything like that.
Yeah, so we use a local company called Louisiana Fresh. So we'll get we do about 0.7 gallons of cucumber juice per barrel of beer. So we'll get so basically I'll see how much beer we're going to have in the bright tank, order that many cases of cucumber. We have a juicer in house, so we'll actually hand juice all the cucumbers and the limes.
Wait, you hand juice your own cucumbers?
Yeah,
that's insane.
It's fun the first.
You don't just
times,
order puree or pre-juiced stuff and then
no.
Okay.
We've ordered some not extracts, but purees from Florida Bulk, and they're fine. They're just not quite right. So we just juice them ourselves. We bought an industrial juicer from a local kombucha company. They got a bigger one. And actually tomorrow we're juicing. So if you happen to be in town and you want to help out. But yeah, it's fun. I mean, it's good too. It's fun. It makes the brewery smell good and, it puts a little more love into the beer. So.
And so your brewers get experience juicing in addition to brewing beer.
Yeah. It's like they scatter like cockroaches when I bring the cases out. They're nowhere to be found.
So how many cases of cucumbers do you go through with this industrial juicer for a 30 barrel plus batch?
Yeah, tomorrow we'll package about 80 barrels of Gose, and I think I ordered 16 cases of cucumber. So it'll be a nice long couple hours. But
how much liquid cucumber juice does 16 cases of cucumbers produce?
That'll get me about
curious, like
50 gallons.
Okay.
So, yeah. Right at 50 gallons. So.
And 50 gallons of freshly juiced cucumber in a 80 barrel batch is enough to kind of push that expression of cucumber in?
Yeah, it'll come through. Cool. Yeah, so we have our floor hopper. It's about a 3 barrel floor hopper. So we'll put all the juice into there. We'll add all the close it up, and then we'll bubble CO2 through it for deaerate it, and then we'll pump that in. Then we generally bubble from the bottom of our bright tank for about an hour just to homogenize everything, and then we'll start carbonation from there. So
makes sense. How about lime? How do you do you juice your own limes also?
We just get lime juice. So juicing limes would be a little more difficult, but just lime juice. So
that makes more sense to me.
That's a little easier. That's just that's makes more sense than juicing tiny key limes are very, very tiny. So
how much how much residual sugar comes out of a cucumber or these limes? Now, clearly you're centrifuging before you get to this process, and so you are trying to remove all the yeast, from this to prevent re-fermentation. But you're definitely adding, fermentables back into this mix, and there is even after a centrifuge potential that some yeast gets through. Talk to me about managing that kind of process.
Yeah, we haven't seen any growth. We'll do some lab or basically just do an Erlenmeyer at room temp We haven't seen any growth or any fermentation signs. The cucumbers really don't show up any sugar. If anything, it's very minimal. And we haven't gotten anything from the lime juice either. So it's all pretty minimal. I think once we disperse it all into the bulk of the beer. So yeah, we've been pretty good about that.
Are there other fruit additions that you make that do carry more sugar additions that pose more challenges around that?
Yeah, so our specialty beers are weekly releases of fruited sours. Though obviously we're adding puree to those, and those are picking up some pretty heavy bricks. Those we're treating with sorbate, about 5 parts per billion. So it's really not super high, but it's enough to
That's a knockdown yeast activity.
Exactly. Yeah. So we'll centrifuge all that. We'll do the sorbate, and then we'll do we'll check gravity for a week. So we'll do anywhere from 5 to 7 days. Generally don't see any fermentation, and then we'll go from there. But yeah, those were a little tricky off the start, trying to find the right threshold. Obviously you can go really high with the sorbates and then get people sick, or you can go as small as possible and hope that it's enough to put down the yeast activity.
Right. So with that, it makes sense that centrifuge plus low amounts of sorbate, get you to that point where you're not having to overdo it with chemicals, but it becomes enough to prevent the small amount of yeast that might slip through from doing anything negative there. Yeah.
Yeah. So we've had good results there. So
how much? I mean, obviously, there's plenty of discussion of heavily fruited sour beers and can bombs and everything else floating out there in the world, and it's, as a production-minded brewery that's producing quite a bit of beer, you don't have a luxury of just putting it out there and then hoping everything works out. You need to make sure that things are going right on that.
Right.
But how much for you all does consumer expectation, play into this? Clearly people with these beers, some people know, keep it refrigerated and keep it in good shape, and other people wonder why their cans are deforming, as they have left them warm in their car for a week.
Right.
For you all, you don't have the luxury of being there and explaining things to people, and so you just kind of have to make sure that it's in good shape as it goes out of your brewery.
Yeah, that's a lot of weight on the shoulders of a brewery, and I think you owe it to the consumer. And we talked about that earlier of making sure that you're taking efforts to put out the most quality product. And not to say that we haven't had our issues with exploding cans. Early on we were having a few issues, and we've really ramped up our lab and sensory program and our incubation, and we're putting a lot of our fruited sours at 110 degrees and not seeing anything after a month. No explosions. Cans get a little tight, but check carb and it's only gone up 0.2. So we generally carb our fruited sours to about 2.2 volumes. So it may go up to like 2.3, 2.4, which is fairly insignificant as far as
you're still within the threshold for cans.
Right. And but things like that are really important to us. We've bought back a lot of beer. We've recalled product. A lot of these small batch beers early on. Our Houston brew pub had a few issues early on, and we, conscious effort that we won't put this beer out again until we figure out our process, and we've done a great job of that. I mean, we've had, here we go again, almost 2 years now of no exploding cans. So I'm sure I'll get.
We're jinxing everything right now.
Might as well throw it out there. But yeah, I think it's really important. I don't think it's on the consumer at all. I just saw a Reddit thread about a local brewery having some issues, and everyone was kind of dogging on this guy about, you need to keep it in the fridge. It needs to be kept at 30 degrees. And it's like, what is it, a COVID vaccine? We need to keep them at sub thermal temperatures to store beers. Like that's not fair to the consumer. And rightfully so. You shouldn't keep them out, especially in our heat. Out in your 110 degree garage, but. I think the consumer should feel safe buying a beer from the store, going home, putting it in their fridge, and not expecting it to explode in their face. And I think that's a fair, unspoken agreement between the brewery and the consumer. I'd be pissed if that happened to me.
Sure. It's an interesting and weird time in beer for that.
It is.
And we see it with this past year of everyone pivoting to small canning lines and having to do that in order to stay alive and dealing with oxygen issues that come with that because it's, eliminating oxygen when you're selling it all over your tap, out of serving tanks or out of kegs, in your own tap room is just less of a concern. If something turns, dump the rest of the kegs and,
Right.
you move on. But, once that's in a can, well, you've got a huge investment in time if you've used a mobile canner and, cans that are harder to get these days, all of these other things, and having to recall a batch just because of the beer has gotten shattered through oxygen, like that sucks.
Right.
And so we're in this it's been a huge learning curve for commercial breweries out there over the past year on that kind of thing. Same kind of thing with these kinds of progressive beer styles with heavily fruited, American sour beers. They pose these technical challenges and, I think the window for accepting that learning curve is there, and we're past that at this point
Right.
in the consumer market because enough breweries have spent the last couple of years figuring out how to get better at this so that isn't a concern for their beers.
Yeah, and I think on multiple levels too. If you're not reaching out to other local breweries or our industry is so wide open, there's so many resources now to reach out to for us, we don't have as many breweries in New Orleans as, Fort Collins or San Diego or, bigger cities. But, there's enough people. You can get on the phone. You can get on the Master Brewers website. You can get on, simple Google. I mean, you can find resources. There's no excuse to put out these inferior products and put it on the consumer, and it's like, well, it's not our problem. It's yours now, and that type of mindset makes the industry as a whole look bad. And I don't think that's really fair to put on the consumers. But I do think you have to take some responsibility for your product. And, we look at our products. If our DO is high on one of our beers, then, we can't put it out. That's not fair to the consumer. We talked about Lime Cucumber have a following, our Paradise Park Lager. If we put out a beer that's 500 parts per, million DO, and we're like, well, it'll be out there and it's not our problem. It'll sell fast enough, whatever. That's not really fair to the consumer that loves our product, buys it religiously, and they go to have it and it's a subpar experience. Like, I just don't, I don't think that's, you shouldn't have to shoulder that burden as a consumer. And, now that we've stepped up our lab and sensory a lot more, and I think it's been really helpful and eye-opening to see how we can better our process and make ourselves, of course, you want to be efficient and, profitable because that's why you run a business. But at the same time, the only way to really do those things is to be consistent and have people trust that your product is going to be great every single time and not a, flip of a coin.
Sure. No, and I think that's why, most of us got into this in some way or another, that no one got into this to make money by putting subpar product out there into the market that that people connected with in unpleasant ways. Everyone's here that I know does it because they want to make people happy, and ultimately, beer makes people happy. And if we can kind of keep focused on that, then and use that as kind of a guiding principle, I think we'll be better in general. We've talked a lot about technical stuff, which is actually pretty fun. Normally, but one of the things we haven't talked about is creative process. I'm interested in this because, again, you all approach it from this like flavor kind of idea with, branding that then expresses itself in different kinds of styles of beverage, with a similar kind of flavor branding on it. Talk to me a little bit about that creative process behind Urban South and how you all think about and build flavors and then settle on and then build these flavor brands that you then extend into different realms.
Yeah. So, a lot of our core products, obviously Lime Cucumber, transcends from seltzer to Gose, Rocket Pop as well. There's a lot of brand recognition with our beer first, and now we're kind of stepped into the seltzer game. So we wanted to have that kind of cross recognition. It's also, at the end of the day, as much effort and time as we spend making the product, forecasting the products, selling the product, social media, marketing, to create a new product, and how do we develop these seltzers? And I remember day one of seltzer recipe development. We were trying to think of all these crazy ideas and different flavors, and then it kind of hit us like, why don't we take some of our heavy hitting beer flavors and put them into seltzer form? And it's easy marketing. It's already done. We'll just refresh it for the seltzer. It's recognizable. People like it. It's tried and true, and it helped us to kind of like refocus on like, we do have this strong following on some of these core products, and that takes a little of the creative process out, because then you already have it ready to go, and you're just dialing up the flavors and recipes and going from there. But with some of our weekly releases, we do a lot of these heavily fruited sours. There's a kind of a series that I personally love and kind of proud of right now, is our fruited coffee sour series called Drip. Those have been really fun. Work with
fruited coffee sour.
Fruited coffee sours, yeah. I'll have to send you. The last one we just did was we did an orange and almond coffee sour. So we did a Honduran natural coffee. It tastes like a almond orange creamsicle. It's pretty insane, but those have been really fun. But things like that, where kind of stepping out of the box, stepping out of the realm. And a lot of people are doing fruited coffee sours, but maybe not a lot of people, but a few people. But things like that, where I look at.
What's the creative process behind it? Like, where do you find the inspiration? And then talk me through how you build what you're actually going to flavor this with, and then, how that process looks. Because, when you come up with almond coffee sour, that just seems, like there's a whole bunch of problems to solve along the way to from the idea into the execution.
Yeah, I think it's brewing 101. It's just solving problems. It's not necessarily you creating no solutions. You're just trying to figure your way to the end product. But with something like that, our marketing director, Abby, had a cocktail one time that was a orange and almond cocktail. She was like, I feel like this would make a good fruited sour. And then we started talking, and I was like, I feel like that'd make a really fun drip, kind of a more courageous drip, because all the other ones we've done have been a lot of berry fruits, strawberry, raspberry.
Sure. Playing on some of the flavors that are already there in the coffees.
Exactly. And something like this is really stepping out of the boundary of coffee a little bit, or maybe at least what most people, think of when they think of coffee. So this is something we put on paper. She got the labels made, and we went from there. So it's kind of, it took a sweeter orange profile. So my whole idea behind it has a lactose base as well. So it's actually called Drip Olay. But we did kind of this like almond cream base, and then sweeter orange. So we got Valencia orange juice, added that, kept adding orange until it was like just enough before it got like too tangy, too sour, because you're already on top of a sour base. And then, I did 12 pounds of coffee.
When you say keep adding orange, are you saying you're like adding this through your dosing tank, tasting the result, and then kind of evaluating, recirculating to homogenize, and then tasting it?
Exactly. So, added a little bit, recirculate our pump, add a little bit more until it was kind of getting to that point where it was a little too tangy, and that's where I stopped. And then with the coffee, it was a Honduran natural coffee was pretty pineapple-y and kind of fruity and funky smelling. We did half whole bean, half coarse ground. So it was about 3 pounds of coffee per barrel of beer. So I do a coarse ground steep first. That really helps get like a lot of that like flavor on the palate. And then I kind of consider the whole bean, which is kind of a waste of a bean, but it does give that really, really, really almost like a fresh bag of coffee smell. And I think that a lot of times gives people the perception more of the coffee, and it's not necessarily killing the palate, because they can kind of get a little weird in the palate. But if you do enough coarse ground where there's some flavor, but enough whole bean where there's big aroma, you can kind of create that kind of 360 profile that I think really works well in this beer.
Oh, so that product. You mix whole bean and ground coffee.
I do both, yeah. And then with the whole bean, you have a little bit more of a window before it gets to that bell pepper. I really see after about 42 hours, we'll start to pick up that bell peppery, pepper skin. flavor. But with coarse ground, I don't like to go over 24 hours. If anything, I'd like to just go like 12 hours. So I might do it like late in the evening and pull it the next morning to avoid any like over extraction. Especially with the sour, it tends to pull a little harder than if you're on a more basic beer.
Makes sense. That's interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's been a fun, definitely a learning experience with coffee and sour and fruit and everything else. But it's been, I think people are liking them. Definitely adventurous.
How do you balance the acidity with, that kind of roasty, potential, the sharpness that coffee brings to it?
Yeah, and that's always a challenge as well. And I think what the whole bean brings is you get a little less of that. A lot of times we'll have the roaster kind of go to that medium to light roast, so it's not as acidic. Also, think the time helps a lot. I think having them cup the coffee beforehand, they kind of tell you this one tends to pour a little more acidic. This one's a little more full and rich. If a coffee's going to be more acidic, I might go, 1.5 pounds per barrel, or even 1 pound per barrel versus, 3 pounds per barrel. With something, this natural is a little more sweet and full, and they say a lot of like sugarcane, molasses type mouthfeel. So I felt a little safer going 3 pounds per barrel on that one. But yeah, I think, and that's another thing, reach out, how does this coffee drink? Because they know their coffee's in and out, and that's a good way to know. And with the thing, you can always add more. You can never go back. So that's, the way we kind of look at a lot of our fruit sours.
Sure. What I love about this is, we've spent a lot of time talking about, quick sour beers. Mm-hmm. And, at the same time, they're not the biggest beers that you brew. Like I said, you brew IPAs, lagers, a whole lot of other styles of beer, as well. This is just one of the more fun kind of areas that you all love to play and explore in. But Alex, it's been really fun to talk to you about this. From a big picture standpoint, what's next for Urban South? Where do you all see this going? And what's the next big challenge on your horizon?
Yeah, we're continuing to grow. We're expanding our markets. We just opened up Tennessee. We opened up South Alabama and South Mississippi. It's been really great. We're always looking for new markets. We'd love to open up another tap room somewhere, kind of like our Houston Brew Pub. So it'd be its own entity, own brew team. A new market. Nothing really on the horizon yet, but it's kind of we've pitched that idea around quite a bit. I think you see a lot of breweries right now kind of doing that same format. It's a good way to enter a new market and put skin in the game. For us, we're really getting into our lab. I think quality has been a big thing for us, and it's been great. Trying to keep up with demand. Now that all the bars and restaurants are finally opening up, we're seeing an uptick in sales, which is great. So, continue to build out our facility and focus on efficiencies and quality, and just keep on building a great team. It's been incredible growth the past couple of years, and try to stay innovative. That's where things like drip have come out, and I'd really love to stay on that cutting edge for our team and the city. It's been fun to see all the love and craziness we've been able to push out of our brewery the past couple of years. But
it's exciting stuff.
Keep talking to people like you. Win some more medals.
Yeah, for sure. Well, fingers crossed for you guys this year.
Yeah.
If what I've tasted is any example, then I think your chances are really good.
Yeah, I'll send you some of the drip for sure.
Awesome. Contact G&D Chillers about the best damn chillers in the world. Give your yeast a helping hand with Pathfinder N-Pure Seltzer Nutrient. Craft concentrate blends from Old Orchard are packed with real fruit first. Brewmation puts you in control to design a brewery that fits your needs. Make your system 100% food safe with Clarion lubricants. Of course, if you want to support this podcast, go to beerandbrewing.com. Click on the subscribe button. We have a whole bunch of awesome content coming down the pipeline for our all-access subscribers on the pro and the consumer side, and some really killer classes that we filmed a couple weeks ago in California, including classes with folks like Firestone Walker, Russian River, Alvarado Street, Cellar Maker, etc. We have a brand new course out this month right now with Jester King, Jeff Stuffings of Jester King, talking about brewing farmhouse ales. So fantastic content coming out of that channel, and we would love your support out there for it. Our next episode coming up, podcast episode 200. It's some sort of arbitrary milestone because it's an even number. And so we're going to call it special just for that reason. But we have Ken Grossman from Sierra Nevada joining us for a conversation I recorded a couple of weeks ago when I was out in California from a beautiful coast of California. And it's a fun one to check back in with Ken, who's been such a force in the brewing industry. Alex, if people want to learn more about Urban South and what you do, try to find your beers and taste some of your handiwork, where do they find you all?
Yeah, so you can come to our tap room in New Orleans, located right outside of downtown. Urban South Beer is our Instagram handle, Urban South Brewery on Facebook. We do have a Twitter, probably not as popular with most people.
Twitter sucks.
Yeah. And
there's no picture. Well, I guess there could be pictures.
Some pictures, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're most heavily on Instagram and Facebook, and reach out. And we also sell beer through Tavor. So if that serves one of your lovely cities, you can also buy it through there. And if you live in the Houston area, we have a brew pub in the west side of Houston. So come check us out.
Well, it's been fun to talk to you about brewing these quick sour beers, flavor forward, fruit forward, etc. Appreciate you sharing your thoughts. We got fairly in depth there, and it was kind of fun to pick that apart.
That was fun. A little philosophical.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, thanks for talking to me on the podcast. Cheers.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good one.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.